Tradition of news leadership on News 8, working in the spirit of Texas.
This is an ABC News special.
In New Hampshire tonight, Vice President Bush is back on his feet, and Governor Michael Dukakis has scored a convincing win over his Democratic rivals. The primary is over. The people of New Hampshire have once again spoken with a clear and strong voice.
From ABC News. This is the 88th vote. Tonight, round 2, the New Hampshire primary. Reporting from Manchester, New Hampshire, Peter Jennings and David Brinkley.
Good evening. David Brinkley and I are broadcasting tonight from what used to be the largest textile mill in the world. In New Hampshire, economic times are better now, but this mill is closed.
And well, like the other, even more cheap labor in the Orient, so they're closing down there.
Our story tonight is here, but it's also going to be in the South. And the headline from here tonight comes from George Bush. Reports of my death are premature. The easiest way to wrap up the beginning is to take a look at the board. Let's look first at the Republican race, where George Bush scored quite a convincing win tonight, making something of a comeback after losing to Bob Dole in Iowa last week. With almost all of the vote in, George Bush comes first, Robert Dole comes second. Kemp is a fairly convincing third, moving up higher than the polls had anticipated he would be. Pete DuPont doesn't do very well at all, but says he will stay in the race and go down south. Pat Robertson comes in fifth, a disappointment for him, as he says, but the South is a ground on which he would rather compete. Let's take a look at the Democrats now. The Democrats, much more predictable. Michael Dukakis, the governor of next door Massachusetts, does just about as well as the polls said he would, and about as well as he expected. Richard Gephardt comes in second after fighting it out with Paul Simon. That makes it very difficult for Paul Simon now to go out and raise money, but he says he will go on to the South. Richard Gephardt certainly will. Jesse Jackson has done better here than he did 4 years ago. Al Gore didn't campaign very seriously here and is waiting for all the other candidates in the South. Bruce Babbitt will likely drop out of this race by the end of the week. And at the bottom of the list, Gary Hart, who said, let the people decide. The people decided. He came in absolutely last. Let's go to New York very briefly to Lynn Scher, who's been looking at our exit polls and will tell us exactly why New Hampshireites voted for whom and who they did.
Peter, in the end, it was George Bush's emphasis on his resume and on his Reagan administration credentials that convinced the New Hampshire voters. He even won among conservative Republicans. When we asked why they voted for Bush, more than half said it was his experience in government, and that was cited by just over a third of Bob Dole's voters. 43% of Bush's voters said they liked his stand on the deficit, and 1/3 said they approved of his stand on taxes, which is, of course, not to raise them. It was clear that the vice president's continued reminder that he worked with and for Ronald Reagan also worked with the folks in New Hampshire today. Our poll showed that some 3/4 of the voters believe the country should keep moving in the direction the president has taken us. Of them, 39% voted for Bush. Senator Dole was behind there, and Jack Kemp behind him. On the Democratic side, Governor Dukakis won because he won virtually every political group, from liberals to conservatives to independents, and he won nearly every demographic group. He also did best in the issue Democrats said was among the most important, reducing the federal budget deficit. Among those who cited that issue, 35% voted for Dukakis, 21% for Paul Simon, and only 14% for Richard Gephardt. But the governor's victory here does not necessarily mean he'll move into the South with ease. In fact, Dukakis was challenged on 2 fronts by his nearest rivals. Paul Simon among the young, affluent, and well-educated voters, and perhaps more important, Gephardt gave him a run among conservative and less affluent voters, the type of voters who could hold the key to the Super Tuesday vote in the South. Those latter are some of the same Democrats who voted for Ronald Reagan in 1984. And in New Hampshire, Dukakis and Gephardt virtually split their vote. Paul Simon was a poor third. Finally, Gary Hart. In 1984, he won largely with independent voters. This year, he got only a tiny 5% of their votes. Peter?
Well, I hope you heard Lynn Scher, because we didn't. But thank you, Lynn, very much for the shape of the vote. Something a little different about this broadcast tonight. There are going to be no interviews with candidates, winners or losers. I don't think we've ever done that before.
I don't think so, and there's another distinction. It's the first real primary with Harold Stassen in it. I mean, yes, he's in it.
Based on what you see today, he's in it?
Yes, he's a candidate in this primary. His name is on the ballot. I haven't seen any votes for him, but his name is on the ballot. And I kind of think it's not real unless Stassen is in it, because he's been running for president since 1948, 40 years.
Okay, well, as you mentioned about textiles earlier on, we're going to move on to the South. We'll come back and we'll look at how the Democrats might do in the South and how the Republicans might do in the South in just a moment.
This is the 88th vote, ABC News coverage of the New Hampshire primary, brought to you tonight by Citicorp.
All the way to the convention. Let's listen briefly to what the other Republicans had to say about the shape of their victory, or less than victory.
And I congratulate the winner, but I must also say that I can stand here with my head held high because I know that my message of making a difference, my message of strong leadership, my message of deficit reduction and honesty and integrity are going to sell in the South just as they sold in New Hampshire and the state of Iowa. From here we go on to Minnesota, South Dakota, South Carolina, Super Tuesday, and New Orleans. And with you and the type of folks that you represent around this country, ladies and gentlemen, the growth, hope, and opportunity wing of the Republican Party is going to prevail over the orthodox status quo wing of our party, and that's because of the start that you gave to Ronald Reagan in 1980 and the start that you've given to Jack Kemp in 1988. God bless you for it. The point is that our message has reached the people of New Hampshire in their homes, around their kitchen tables, at the places where they work. They like the message of opportunity. They like the message of the future. I'm going to take a lead by the hand. This is the last clean shirt I've got. We're going to go get some more, and we'll see you in a place that's warmer. God bless you, and thank you very much.
We played in New Hampshire, which according to George Bush is his backyard, and he won convincingly. But ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow morning, I go into the South, and they're going to be playing in my backyard.
George Bush came out of this looking good and feeling good, Peter, but maybe not everyone has heard. The other day, he sounded like a man who was prepared to lose. He said to the press, and as I say, maybe not everyone has heard this, he said to this, I don't have to do this. I am 63, I've got some mileage on me, and I could just as easily be over here in his house in Maine listening to the surf pounding on the ocean, playing with his grandchildren, and drinking a beer. He feels better now.
Do you think that he has shown a lack of passion?
No. I think he was a little worried at that time that he may wind up a loser.
It was Governor Sununu who said this week that what he was doing was see me, touch me, feel me campaigning. Unusual for George Bush.
Yes, he's not used to that. He's never done it before in his life and may never do it again.
Okay, let's go to George Bush headquarters now and talk to ABC's Barry Serafin. Barry, what is George Bush going to do in the South? What does his campaign say he has to do in the South?
Well, the Bush camp thinks that the Vice President is now moving to his area of strength, his area with the strongest organization and strongest support, and that what happened here in New Hampshire tonight will shore up any wavering in that support. So he's heading for the South, starting Thursday with a swing toward Missouri, Texas, and probably South Carolina.
Who does he think his challenger is down there?
Well, he knows his challenger is Bob Dole, and Bob Dole knows the South is going to be the main battleground. Senator Dole has some more immediate fish to fry in places like Minnesota and South Dakota, but he knows he has to compete in the South. He knows he's playing catch-up organizationally down there, and he's going to be targeting. He won't be trying to win everywhere. He's going to look for specific districts and targets of opportunity.
Okay, Barry, thank you very much. Joining us from our Washington Bureau tonight is ABC's George Will. And George, we have heard Pat Robertson say that the South is his backyard. How do you define the contest down there?
Well, Peter,
no one has any idea who is going to vote where down there. 8 of those southern states have open primaries, which means Pat Robertson can, if he can succeed, move conservative Democrats over into the Republican Party. Al Gore and Jesse Jackson come into the race now really for the first time. Neither has competed at full strength up north. So this is something without precedent in American history, and we're going into it not even knowing who's going to vote on which side.
George, sticking with the Republicans for a second, Pat Robertson surprised people in Iowa in a caucus state and didn't do very well in a primary state. What does that tell you, if anything?
Well, I don't think it tells us much, because demographically, New Hampshire just wasn't, as he says, his backyard. But remember, like Babe Ruth pointing to the center field in Wrigley Field, this guy has pointed to South Carolina and said that on the Saturday before Super Tuesday, he's going to beat George Bush. It ain't bragging if you do it, so if he does it, he will change considerably the tone of this race. If we've learned one thing so far this year, and with only, fewer than 500,000 people voting so far, is that the tone of the race can change very dramatically. And if Bob Dole should win South Dakota and Minnesota, and Pat Robertson could win South Carolina, we'd be back in scrambled eggs again.
George, this is impossible to answer, I know, but I'd like to hear you deal with it. How much of a silent or invisible army exists in the South that Robertson can count on, call up?
Well, no one knows, but I don't think they're silent or invisible. I hear their footsteps everywhere, and where the footsteps are really being heard are on courthouse steps, where people are going in large numbers to re-register from the Democratic Party as conservative Democrats into the Republican Party.
Okay, George, David, thank you very much. We're going to come back in just a second and look at the Democrats and see how they are going to do the South. We'll talk to Jeff Greenfield about what Senator Gore has to do down there. Right back.
This is the 88th vote. ABC News coverage of the New Hampshire primary will continue in a moment.
You've got a lot of company.
As we said at the beginning, Governor Dukakis of next door, Massachusetts, carved a commanding lead here in New Hampshire, which was really never challenged in this primary. We're not going to look back except to say that not since 1952 has any Democratic candidate here ever gained more than 10% of the vote. So Governor Dukakis goes south with a very comfortable New Hampshire lead in his pocket. As for the other Democrats and what they thought about how they did, let's listen briefly.
We go on to all the other states, from South Dakota to South Carolina. Everywhere Americans are yearning for change. And wherever I go, wherever I speak, I will carry the message I heard here in New England, where the American idea was first given life. It's not just your vote. It's not just your choice. This is a cause, and it's not a candidacy.
The reality is there are 3 candidates who will emerge from this primary with approximately the same number of total delegates, and the name of the game, ultimately, is delegates.
Here in New Hampshire, we spent $45,000. Opposition, $450,000 plus dollars. They outspent us 10 to 1. Yet we keep getting stronger and stronger and stronger because the message is a rich message.
My pledge to you, from the bottom of my heart, my pledge to all of you, as my friends and my supporters, is I won't walk away from this process. I'll honor your commitment
And somehow, we'll make that change happen together.
At this rate, I calculate we'll win this nomination in about 8 weeks.
Gary Hart goes right on smiling. Standing by at Dukakis headquarters, ABC's Jim Wooten. Jim, Dukakis has managed to seem to be above the fray here. Does he have to get into the scrap in the South?
Well, I think it's interesting to at least speculate, Peter, as to what he will be forced to do down south. I guess political operatives are nothing but realists, and even in the euphoria of this evening here, where he came and saw and gave a speech and said he had no Southern strategy, his political strategists were sort of wandering around pitching a little pragmatism, saying they were going down south not necessarily to win every state, but at least to focus on some target congressional districts, trying to pick up delegates as they go along.
Where are they?
Well, the delegates for Dukakis, he probably feels, are in the urban areas, because as Bert Lance of Georgia likes to say, there ain't too many people named Dukakis in South Georgia.
He's fairly strong, Jim, isn't he, in the caucus states ahead, South Dakota and Minnesota, right?
He is doing very well out there, as far as we can tell. He's also very, very confident about some other primaries in Washington State, in Rhode Island, and of course, he thinks he may do very well in Massachusetts. What they sell here, though, at the Dukakis camp is delegates, 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 and they think they're going to do very well down south. I'm not certain that's a grand strategy.
Okay, Jim, thank you very much indeed. By the way, South Dakota is not a caucus, it is a primary. Missing from that montage of optimism there was Senator Gore. Let us go briefly this evening to Senator Dole's headquarters to talk to ABC's Jeff Greenfield about Senator Gore. What does Gore have to do in the South? It's almost starting from scratch, isn't it, Jeff?
Yes, and he has the advantage of no clear front-runner, Peter. He needs a two-cushion shot. He has not only to do well in the South, but to position himself for the move north to the big industrial states of Illinois, New York, Pennsylvania. Now, if I can put on my ex-strategist hat, if I were Senator Gore's advisors, I would tell them, make Pat Robertson your target. Remind the Democrats that by running too far to the left, they've given the country Nixon and Agnew and Meese and Jim Watt. And say to the Democrats, because it's a message that will play up north with the liberals, if you don't help me be a mainstream Democrat, this Republican Party will be enthralled to Pat Robertson, because Pat Robertson is going to be the boogeyman of Democratic liberals from now till the convention in November.
Jeff, in addition to running for the presidency, Robertson seems to be trying to take charge of the party in several southern states.
Well, indeed, and people forget, that it's not Pat Robertson's invention. That's what Barry Goldwater's people did in 1964. It's what George McGovern's people did 8 years later in the Democratic Party. It's a perfectly honorable tradition, but he's going to scare the living whatsits out of establishment Republicans. And as I say, the Democrats are going to see Robertson as the absolute prince of darkness. And that's why Gore, by going after Robertson and by saying the Republicans are going to be enthralled to him, may be able to make a case that it's either him or Robertson, which is what Carter did in '76 when he warned liberals, vote for me or you'll get George Wallace. It's a possibility.
Jeff, thanks very much. Rebecca Chase, the ABC bureau chief in the South, made an interesting observation the other day, too, in which she said that while all of us in the North were worried about New Hampshire and in the Midwest worried about Iowa, the South really was paying attention to the Gore campaign, and so that he was campaigning to some extent in a vacuum and not so much affected by Iowa and New Hampshire. Let us go briefly to Concord, New Hampshire now and talk to Bob Beckel. He's the former campaign manager for Walter Mondale. He is a political consultant in this year of 1988. And Bob, I'm kind of interested to know what advice you would give to Senator Simon, who came in after Gephardt tonight and is short of money.
Well, Peter, if I was honest with him and was a good campaign manager, I'd tell him that the chances of finding money are about as good as finding a warm night here in New Hampshire in the winter. And that the best thing we can hope to do if he wants to stay in this race is to just survive. He's going to have to stake out the liberal wing of the party, claim himself to be the only real Democrat, and hope he can survive through the South and get to Illinois, his home base. But the reality of the situation is he's not going to have any money. He's got no momentum. And the opportunity for him to pick up anything between now and Illinois is very, very slim.
Okay, Bob, thank you. David, I was going to ask you about Bruce Babbitt.
Well, I think he's probably going to drop out before this week is over. He's
Thursday, in fact, I think.
He has said almost as much himself. He didn't get many votes. He hasn't got much money, and money from here on is really what it's all about. I mean, money is the chicken and the egg in the political campaign. I made some notes here listing the winners and those coming second and third, not by name, but by the amount of money they had. And among the Democrats, $15 million came in first, $8 million came in second, and $3.2 million came in last. Republicans, $25 million came in first, $20 million second, and $14 million third. Now, you can look up the names easily, but that's the money.
Your suggestion is clearly that you could buy the election, or at least you could buy a position on the table.
Well, there are two things. One, you can use money effectively to get votes, or you can use your own personality to get money. So I say it's the chicken and the egg.
I must say that even though Paul Simon did tell his campaign workers to go home and get clean white shirts and be prepared to head off south, the cue to us pretty much in Iowa was that if Simon didn't beat Gephardt here, he would, in the words of one senior campaign staff, retire gracefully at some point. So when it happens, no one should be particularly surprised. We'll be back in a minute.
The 88th vote, the New Hampshire primary, will continue.
Just by way of reminder, Governor Dukakis on the Democratic side, not an enormous surprise, a very commanding lead he had coming in, and he has it going out. On the Republican side, George Bush, I think probably does a little more than save his campaign, but it is worth remembering that he was the odds-on favorite until any vote was cast, and now he's scrapping it up with Bob Dole.
Well, he's in business now. And before we go, New Hampshire, I think, has come to take us for granted. A member of our staff coming to work the other morning stopped in the Dunkin' Donuts right down the street here, and the place was full of limousines with red lights on the top and Secret Service and cops and so on. And he said to the girl behind the counter, who's here? And she said, the vice president. You want one lump or two?
I go away, I must confess, thinking primarily, without it putting any particular emphasis on any campaign, about Shaw's Market. Because it was apparently in Shaw's Market earlier this week in Concord that Bob Dole first began to realize, at least in his own mind, that he had a real shot at winning the presidency. Now, yesterday, he was a good deal more confident that he was going to get closer to Dole than he finally did in tonight's counting. But there's always been this question about Bob Dole and passion, this question about Bob Dole and really wanting it. This Bob Dole, the technocrat, apparently it was in Shaw's Market that he began to feel that he might one day be president.
I've never been to Shaw's Market, and I can't join in this conversation, but I'll tell you, I have a little fantasy I want to tell before our time runs out. What happens to these losers? They go home, in my fantasy, they go home with an armload of cassettes of 30-second commercials. As time passes, they do what Gloria Swanson did in Sunset Strip. They sit alone in the dark looking at their old commercials, remembering their campaign for president that didn't work.
Nice to be with you, David. We go on to Super Tuesday now. We'll have an even greater wrap-up and reaction on World News Tonight tomorrow. Until then, I'm Peter Jennings in Manchester, New Hampshire, along with David Breachley. Thank you for joining us, and good night.
This has been the 88th vote, ABC News coverage of the New Hampshire primary, a presentation of ABC News.
February Learner of the Month, Evelyn Vega.
When I was